Good evening. I'm Susan Boynton, the resident faculty director of the Institute for Ideas and Imagination. Welcome to Wednesdays at the Institute. This is our lecture series featuring our fellows' work. And tonight's speaker is Hiie Saumaa, who is a fellow of the Institute. She is a writer, dance scholar, and a movement educator and a dancer. She has a PhD in English from Columbia University and has taught courses in writing, literature, and critical theory at Columbia University and at New York University. In addition to her university teaching, Saumaa is a certified instructor of Nia dance, the body logos technique, and journey dance. She teaches classes and workshops in sensory-based dance modalities, creative movement, expressive arts, meditative strength training, and somatic awareness. Her research, which explores interconnections between dance, movement, imagination, and creativity, reflects her multidisciplinary orientation and her multivalent interests in the understanding of emotion and embodiment, both in the present and in historical contexts. Her articles have appeared in journals such as Dance Chronicle, Dance Research Journal, the Journal of Dance, Movement and Spiritualities, Somatics Magazine Journal, and Alternative and Complementary Therapies. She's also contributed to the Jerome Robbins newsletter, Hybrid Pedagogy, and Movement Research Performance Journal. Saumaa has a chapter forthcoming next year in the Routledge Companion to Dance Studies entitled Moving Mind and Body, Language and Writings of Simone Forti. In 2017, she was a dance fellow at the New York Public Library for the Performing Arts, where she carried out much of the research on primary sources for her 2 books in progress on the unpublished writings of the choreographer Jerome Robbins, who is the focus of her work this year at the Institute for Ideas and Imagination. This evening, she will speak on Dance for Two, choreographer Jerome Robbins' correspondence with Tanaquil Le Clercq. Please welcome Hiie Saumaa.
Hello, everybody. Oops. Hi. Thank you so much for coming. Thank you, Susan Boynton, for the introduction. Thank you, fellows. And thank you to the staff at the Institute for Ideas and Imagination for all your help. And also, thank you to some friends and colleagues of Jerome Robbins that I've had a chance to speak to these last couple of months here. So I wanted to start by giving you some layers of introduction. So I want to say, I'm not going to assume that everybody knows who Robbins is. So I'm going to say a few words about him, and then also what draws me to his work, and maybe what some of my bigger questions are. Okay? And then I'll move on to the main body of the talk. So when people say that they have not heard of Jerome Robbins, I usually ask them, have you seen the movie musical West Side Story? And they usually have. Robbins did the choreography for that movie and also co-directed it. And it's, by the way, being refilmed under the direction of Steven Spielberg, so you will see a lot of West Side Story in the news soon. Robbins was an immensely prolific American choreographer, director, and dancer. He received 2 Academy Awards and 5 Tony Awards. And what is unusual about him is that he was very successful both as a choreographer of Broadway shows and of classical ballets. And this is very rare because these 2 genres ask for a very different kind of movement language and very different technique. He danced and choreographed for ballet theater, which is now known as American Ballet Theater, and mostly for New York City Ballet alongside George Balanchine. He also worked in film and television. One little known fact about him is that he also doctored shows. So, for example, if you were doing a musical or like a television show and you had a mass scene, and you didn't know how to make those people move, you would ask him, and he came and he helped you choreograph these mass scenes. And he usually didn't take credit for those doctored shows. He composed 54 ballets and 20 Broadway shows, either as a choreographer and a director. This is a special year for people who love his work because we celebrate Robbins' centennial year. The Paris Opera, too, is doing an homage for him. It's an all-night show of 4 of his ballets, so for the next week or so, you can still go and see his works here. Robbins loved Paris and spent a lot of time here, particularly in the 1990s. He rented an apartment actually not too far from here, 12-minute walk, 58 Boulevard Raspail. And he worked with the dancers of Paris Opera and staged his ballets here, which were very well received. He considered the Paris Opera Ballet his second family next to New York City Ballet. I want to show you, this I chose as an image because this is from West Side Story. He was rehearsing dancers for West Side Story, and it's kind of around the same time as it happened around the same time as the letter correspondence that I'll be talking about later. But I wanted to show you a short, like a 3-minute video, so you can see what he sounds like and how he moves. And what I love about this video is that he speaks a little bit about what it's like for him to create. Okay? So another layer of introduction. How did I discover Robbins' work? So about 3-4 years ago, I was doing research on an early 20th century movement and music educator called Elise Bentley, and I discovered that one of the few people who had actually talked about this very little known teacher was Jerome Robbins. And the reason why he talked about Bentley is that Bentley was his first dance teacher when he was a little boy. So this was the research that took me to the dance division at the New York Public Library for the Performing Arts at Lincoln Center, which is where Robbins' archives are held. And as I was going through just a few folders of his writings, I immediately felt, wow, this man is connected to the written word. And when a couple of years later, an announcement came up about a fellowship at the Performing Arts Library, I applied for it, and then as Susan mentioned, that's how my archival work started on him proper. Not many people, even people who know him as a choreographer, know that Robbins wrote a lot throughout his life. And what is amazing about his writings is that he didn't just write in one genre, let's say diaries. He also wrote poems, short stories, erotica. He wrote about his dreams, travels, plays even, plots for ballets, also autobiographical writings. And his archival materials are really immense. So the collection that I've been looking at, called Personal Papers, is 171 boxes. And there's another archival collection that's about his theater and ballet work, and that is close to 600 boxes. And there is a separate collection for his paintings and his photography, because he also painted and took photographs. Okay. So the question that draws me to his work as an intellectual is, what do his writings reveal about his creative life as an artist? And did the writings help him compose, and how? And the reason why I'm intrigued by this question is that I feel like when we discuss a creator's work, we usually tend to focus on that creator's life work, which in Robbins' case would be his dances. But I want to see what the role of what I call adjacent, or adjunct forms of creative life are like, or is like, what the role is like. But another reason why I'm drawn to his work is that it's a simple answer, actually. The answer is his writings move me, and his dance works also move me. And when I work inside or outside of the archives, it's not just an intellectual process of me analyzing and collecting information, but it's also very much, my work is very much driven by emotions and also actually physical sensations. And the reason why I bring this out here is that as a mover, I always feel like that I want to speak for the physical body. So one of my goals in life is to bring more attention to embodiment and how we feel physically when we encounter works of art. And the talk tonight is an example of this. When I first read the correspondence between Robbins and the dancer Tanaquil Le Clercq, I immediately knew that I wanted to talk about these letters because I felt like the connection between the two writers was really moving to me. And the other reason I wanted to talk about them, the dancer and the choreographer, was that Le Clercq and Robbins had a partnership on multiple levels. They danced together on the stage, but they also had this lengthy correspondence that I'll focus on in just a little bit. The term that has been useful in my thinking about this is pas de deux. Pas de deux, or steps for two, is a term for partnering dance in ballet. A grand or classical pas de deux has a particular structure. It's a set structure. But for a dance to be called a pas de deux today, it doesn't have to have that particular structure. So any kind of extensive duet between a male or a female, male and a female, or male-male, or female-female can be a pas de deux. The reason why this concept is useful for me is that I feel like it conjures up certain associations or meanings that a term like conversation or dialogue does not. It evokes physicality and lyricism, because a lot of bad pas de deux are about feelings of love and tenderness. And it also evokes an embodied attentiveness to the other. So, let me move to my talk proper now. And I'll speak a little bit about what Le Clercq and Robbins were like as partners on the stage. I'll show you a little clip of Tanny dancing, and then I'll say a lot about the correspondence between the two of them. So just to say a few words about Le Clercq. She was born here in Paris in 1929, and her family relocated to New York when she was 3. Until then, she had only spoken French, and people she got the nickname Tanny when she moved to the States. She studied at the School for American Ballet and was George Balanchine's muse, and from 1952 until 1969, also his wife. Critics and audiences praised Le Clercq's dancing and her charismatic personality and her elegance and her talent for comedic roles. Le Clercq's dancing mesmerized Robbins. In 1948, on his 30th birthday, Robbins attended the premiere of New York City Ballet and wrote, and I'll quote this. I'll quote. I saw a performance that included Symphony in C, with Maria Talchif and Tanny, and at the end of the second movement, I was just dissolved by tears watching the beauty of it. And I went home and wrote him, so Robbins wrote to Balanchine, and said, I'd like to come and work for you. I can be a dancer. I can be a choreographer. I can be an assistant. I can be a stagehand. Whatever you want. I'd like to come and be part of the company. And I got a phone call saying, come. And I went. So a little over a month later, in November of 1949, Robbins joined New York City Ballet as a dancer and as an associate director. Robbins' and Le Clercq's most famous dance partnership was in Balanchine's Bourrée Fantasque in 1949. There is no video recording of them dancing together. There's very little. There's only like one clip of Robbins dancing that has survived. So I can't show you any of their dance partnership, but we have some images, some studio photos. So I use this also for my poster. You see the two of them here in that particular role. And what critics and dancers who were also part of that particular ballet point out repeatedly is that these two were just so funny on the stage. They were funny as separate people, but they were also really funny together. And from these photos, you can tell that too. Balanchine played with this height dynamic here too and staged them on the stage so that Robbins was shorter than Le Clercq. Yes? Okay. Now, Robbins famously claimed that all the ballets he ever did as a choreographer, it was always for Tanny. That's a quote. She premiered in Robbins's ballet Afternoon of a Faun in 1953, and I'll show you a little clip of that later. And he also created the role of a mad ballerina in his comic ballet, The Concert, on her, and in a few other roles as well. Robbins said, I'll quote again, "I am very touched by the people I work with, and I am very sensitive to Tanaquil Le Clercq's dancing. Her talent could take in almost anything. When you think of the parts that I created for her, I mean they're all danced by 5 or 6 different women. No one can do them all. She could do the concert, she could do that crazy thing, or she could be very elegant and she could be very classical. She was really a phenomenal dancer." End quote. So I'll show you half of the ballet, Afternoon of a Faun. So you will see the female lead is Tanaquil Le Clercq, and the Faun is danced by Jacques D'Amboise from New York City Ballet also. This is a historically valuable recording. The quality is not that great, but I hope it's okay. So this work is a restaging of Nijinsky's ballet, which was performed by Ballet Russe in 1912. As you see, you will see Robbins restage it so that he brought the setting to contemporary ballet studio. And yeah, just see, I wanted you to see it also so that you can get an example of Robbins's choreography and an example of his pas de deux. And I'll say a few words about some themes later. So one aspect maybe that you noticed here is that it feels like the dancers are looking at you, the audience, rather than one another. And that's purposefully so, because Robbins wanted to make the audience assume the position of the mirror. So in a ballet studio, the dancers were as if looking at the mirror, and the mirror is you. And that's a very common theme in Robbins's, a quite common theme in Robbins's work. He likes to depict dancers doing what they're doing on a regular basis. They're in the rehearsal room working on their craft. Another common theme here is that of absorption, being really absorbed, and as if not dancing to you, the audience members, but in their own world, there for themselves and one another. This very kind of private and intimate setting is also common in Robbins's works, as is this kind of tender lyricism that's, for example, the kiss at the end. It's not a kiss between two lovers who are madly in love with one another. It's not a big passionate kiss, but it's a meaningful, deeply felt moment of connection between the two people. So this version was recorded in 1955, and the following year, 1956, is a tragic one for the history of dance, because New York City Ballet went on an 11-week European tour, and in October of that year, Tanaquil Le Clercq didn't feel good after one performance, and she fell ill and was diagnosed as having polio and was placed in an iron lung, and she stayed in Europe until March of 1957, when she was finally strong enough to be flown back home. So her arms recovered partially, but her legs never recovered, and so she was in the wheelchair until the end of her life. She started teaching at the Dance Theater of Harlem in New York and wrote 2 books and created crossword puzzles. But she didn't really talk that much about her experience of polio publicly, and also stayed away from the camera eye. So the letters between her and Robbins are really valuable documents also, because we get a sense of what her life was like right during the moment of this illness. So let me now switch gears and talk about them as, here they are, as correspondence. Robbins' and Le Clercq's correspondence is one of the most extensive letter collections in the Robbins archives. It is contained in 3 boxes, which is quite remarkable because usually the letters are just in a few folders. And what is really unique about this correspondence is that we hear the voices of both authors. And that is only because Robbins saved carbon paper copies of his letters to Tanny, and so the archivists were able to place those letters next to Tanny's letters. It is much more common that we see letters that Robbins received in the archives, but we don't usually see Robbins' own writing as a correspondence. So that's one thing that's particularly striking about this correspondence. Now, the archives have a few letters from Le Clercq from 1950 until 51, before she contracted polio. And in these letters, the 21-year-old Tanaquil asked the 32-year-old Robbins about the books that she should read, and talk about her own reading experience and her dance rehearsals and the travels abroad. And but the bulk of the correspondence is from 1956 and 57, which is exactly the time when she got ill, and the following year. So I wanted to demonstrate to you a little bit of what I was alluding to before, which was this idea that research, being in the archives, can also be an emotionally and even viscerally powerful experience. So I'll use the idea of handwriting to demonstrate my point. So I'll show you a few images. Don't try to read anything. These are really for visual purposes only. So this is Le Clercq's letter from 1951 or 50. And so you see the kind of handwriting that she had. Very small, neat letters. Handwriting covers the page almost fully. And it's very legible, actually. Very orderly. And she would also draw little pictures to animate the page. Another one, you see a little picture here also, little doodle. So imagine you as a person in the archive, you are used to you're used to reading these letters, okay? And then you see a letter like this. It's hard to see, but that's part of the point too. So this is written in pencil, and instead of the very clear, orderly, neat handwriting, you all of a sudden see what looks like scribbles, and the handwriting is very shaky, and it almost feels like, just by looking at this page, not even reading this page, you feel like something really big must have happened to this person. And it almost feels like you're looking at the handwriting of a child who's just learning how to write and how to draw the letters. So that's the emotional effect that seeing this kind of letter has. And then you read. I can read you what is actually written here. Dear Jerry, I love you. XXX. What a wonderful letter. I cried. I cry all the time. I can't stop feeling sorry for myself. I keep asking why me, why polio? I can't write anymore. It's with my left hand. I shall dictate to the editor. Love, Tan. In another letter, also in this kind of wobbly script, as a different letter, but I'm going to quote a different letter. She said, please write, I'm so nervous. I'm so scared of pain. Why me? I feel like a looker-on, like this was someone else. I'm not even anxious to get well. My first wish is just to have this stop. When I read in the papers of brave people, I wonder how they do it. I suppose it's because they believe in something and I somehow don't. So when you see this kind of handwriting and then you hear also how she talks about her physical body, I can give you a quote about that too. For example, she says, "My legs are still dead. They're trying electricity on the leg muscles 3 times a week. If I could just feel something down there, some muscle might contract. The past makes me cry. It seems so wonderful." So when you see this kind of handwriting and you read the content of the letters too, I feel like the handwriting itself makes imagining this person's pain even more visceral, more real to you as the researcher. This is another example. So what happens is in the archives you'll see her mother started to write her letters for her, and so Tani would sign her name at the bottom. So how did Robbins respond to Le Clercq's physical and emotional trauma? And so what kind of writing voice do we see emerging from his side of the story? His letters, by the way, are very long, like 2 to 5 single-page typed letters. One distinct feature of this correspondence is that it's actually very funny. It's very humorous. And both Le Clercq's writing is funny and Robbins's is also. And they share a certain kind of sense of humor, which is witty and it has an edge, it has a bite. They're also a little mean to one another at times in their humor. And the humor is very important. It's just not there to somehow be lighthearted about the illness, but it helped manage their fear. Le Clercq said, for example, let me quote. "Sometimes when I start to think, I get scared. Well, not scared exactly, perhaps uneasy is the word. And it's always at night and alone. Well, you just can't be scared when you're laughing and realize what a wonderful ami you have. The pen is mightier than the word, isn't that the saying? Well, I do agree completely. Somehow, it's so easy to write to you. Why? And you're so nice and easy when you write back. I think I might just keep on writing to you even when I'm back in New York City. Silly, isn't it?" Another feature of these letters, let me just move on. Another feature of these letters is that they're very affectionate also. So both sides repeatedly say, "I miss you so much," and "What is it that you're doing at this particular moment?" And I have quotes I can read you also if you want, but maybe I'll just move on for the sake of time. But I think it's important to clarify also that these were not letters between 2 romantic partners. Robbins, I've heard people say, was madly in love with Le Clercq, but Le Clercq was at that time married to Balanchine and made it very clear to Robbins that she was devoted to the other choreographer. Now, one thing that is really fascinating to me about this correspondence is that it almost feels like the 2 of them served as one another's language teachers, and you see how passionately these 2 people cared not just only about movement, but they also really cared about language and words. One thing that Robbins does over and over in these letters is that he corrects her grammar and her idioms, and then he says, "Well, but I'm a nice boy and I'm going to stop this." And her revenge is to teach Robbins some French lessons and to really point out all of his grammatical errors when it comes to French. So they have this kind of back and forth about language. But it's not that they're just poking fun at one another's linguistic quirks. It also seems to me that they were also inspiring creativity in one another and really helping one another become more imaginative in different ways. So, for example, Robbins told Le Clercq very clearly that you're a good writer. I really, when I read your writing, I can imagine very well what you feel. And he also praised Tani's sense of humor. And then, this is a kind of a cute thing that he did. Robbins gave Le Clercq little writing prompts. So, for example, he would say, do you need some opening lines? Like, there's a man that I know that's just great. Or, son visage est beau aussi son esprit. Please work on these. And then he also gave her words to think about. Besides worrying about the word fickle, would you please worry for a while about the following words, because I'm too busy. Ilk, funk, metal, fiddle, couth, and gambit. Let me know what you think about these words. And so these served as a way to inspire Le Clercq to write, but I also feel like Robbins was doing this very consciously to take Le Clercq's mind away from her illness also, to like help her. Another thing I find really fascinating about this correspondence and Robbins in general, because he didn't do this just with Le Clercq, but he would send Le Clercq poems and limericks. And Le Clercq was very much in love with these and asked him to send her some more. And Robbins also sent her illustrated letters, and Le Clercq said, oh, you draw so nicely. He did draw very nicely, by the way. One way in which we see how Le Clercq gets more creative is that she started to play with X's and O, like kisses and hugs. XXOO, yes. I want to show you some examples of this. So, from the left, wide kiss. Then in the center, these little X's that make like a triangle, that look like a flock of birds. That is titled Kisses Migrating. And then there's one that looks like a V with little X's inside. These are boomerang kisses. And they come back. So she added little witty titles. Oh, here we have quivering kisses. Quivering kisses. See? Then, oh, this is a little map. And it shows how the X's, the kisses, go from Lenox Avenue to from me to you. These X's travel. Here we have some automatic kisses. Boom, 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 boom. Then hiccupy kissing, you see? One line, a little hiccup, hiccup, hiccup. Then this is a kisses stitch pillow here. You see a little pillow with X's inside? And then to the right you have invasion kiss. A pair of shoes with X's at the bottom, you see? And here we have a whole bunch. One kiss in the middle there. One kiss, then empty space, leading to another kiss. I mean, I can talk about these later if you want. But what is really fun about this is that Le Clercq turned something that's like a formulaic sign into a creative exploration. And they had a little competition, I guess, also because Robbins said that you won, your kisses are much more fun and inventive than mine. You brought out the competitive nature in me, and I'm already starting to think what to draw at the end of the letter. I love the kisses migrating, and particularly the boomerang kiss. Okay. Let me show you some photos also. So Le Clercq and Robbins, they both loved photography a lot. This is something that bonded them also. And these are, she's already in the wheelchair. These are photos that Robbins took of Le Clercq. This is, I don't know if she played the clarinet. Maybe she doesn't really write about that, but this is her practicing the clarinet. This photo I just love very much. As you can see how many layers, one artist looking at the other artist, and both of them are present here. And this is them together. And this is Le Clercq in 1967. Yeah, this is around the same time. Now, I think that this time spent on writing letters to Robbins and listening to his feedback really, I don't know for sure, but I feel like it helped Le Clercq gain more confidence as a writer, because she actually published 2 books after this correspondence. And I also think that this correspondence helped Robbins understand something about his craft as well. Because in these letters, he writes more openly about certain things that he doesn't really write about elsewhere. Like, he writes about his sight and how he sees differently. He writes about concentration and absorption. He writes about his classes, his acting classes, and how he wants to take classes in photography. He writes about his plants. He loved nature. And I have quotes about that too, if you want me to read some of those later. But in terms of the correspondence, let me just mention this to you, that as the months of 1957 pass by, the carbon copies of Robbins' letters decrease. And this might be due to the fact that Le Clercq moved back to the US and they actually started calling more often. And then they lived in the same city, so there was less of a need to actually write to one another. But the emotional story that the archives tell, so again, back to the researcher in the archives, is that it really at some point gets very sad to see only like one letter after the other by Tanny and not to see any letters from Robbins in return. So it really feels like Robbins as if stepped out of that conversation. And when I was reading those letters by Tanny, she also, by the way, writes a lot, saying things like, why don't you write me more often? You know, write me more often. So there's this sense of loneliness in the content of the letters. But it also felt to me that her writing got more meandering and less sharp and less witty. So it feels like it was the presence, it was the parade, it was the presence of the other person that really brought both of these writers alive. And on their own, it wasn't as captivating, the writing, when the writers didn't have the other person responding. So this intense correspondence was probably both a healing and artistically invigorating time for both writers, and each other's presence via words, humor, and the creative challenge of composing poems, doodles, and sending photographs and illustrated letters was a way for both of them to show that they care for one another, but it was also a way for them to become more artistic. And it was also a way to deal with the difficult situation of Le Clercq's paralysis. And one more little note for me as a researcher is that it was really inspiring to hold in my hands these long letters by these 2 people, and to see how much time they took to actually express the full spectrum of their feelings to one another, and how carefully they responded to everything that was in the other person's letter. And I mean, I'm from the generation where we still wrote handwritten letters, but it really became clear to me how special that kind of writing to another person is these days, when we send lines and text messages and don't really take the time to express fully what we feel. So let me end my talk today by actually giving the last word to my invisible partner, Robbins himself. And I'm going to read you 2 quotes. One is his reflection on what a relationship is. And then the other quote is something that he said about Tanny later in his life. So this is Robbins speaking. Relationship. Kinship, affinity, a state of affairs existing between 2 people, a connection by way of relation. That's Webster's definition. I feel much more about it than that. Love, experiences in common, special experiences which no one else can understand, special experiences which maybe we don't even understand. Times of pleasure in being together, times of antipathy at rehearsals, times of looking at each other and understanding of honesty, of dishonesty, of competitiveness, of pride, happiness and sorrow, and so much more that can't be put into words. You and I understand. Why does our relationship stink? And if it does, on peut faire something about it. That it has had its ups and downs, and the continual tension is not to be denied, nor can I say that it has ever run continually smoothly. But basically I feel there has been a steady love at its roots. So much for all that. I had a dream about Tanny. I looked at her. Her regard was all acceptance, forgiveness. I said, Tanny, walked over to her. I put my arm around her and kissed her on the lips. She was young and old, slim, sad, clear-eyed, and oh so touching. I looked at her again. I kissed her fervently again. It was home. Thank you.
Hello. Yes. Thank you. That was really interesting. I was wondering if you mentioned that he kept carbon copies of the letters that he also sent to her.
Yes.
And I was wondering if you have found in your research other evidence of him doing something similar, as if to start a legacy for himself, if he was had kept other archives with letters with other people, or the photographs that you have there. Did he save those, or were those fans that saved them? If you could comment on that.
Yes, great question. Thank you, Eve. Yes, I mean, the fact that the archives are so big, 600 boxes, another 200 boxes, shows that he liked to keep everything. He really didn't throw much of anything away. So in the archives, you see all kinds of little scribbles that he made on lists of things he had to buy, doctor's notes. So he kept a lot of things. So, but aside from that, I do believe that he wanted to write his own autobiography, and he didn't ever get to that point. But there are a lot of archival materials where he goes through his life thinking about his early teachers, his parents, his family, his influential encounters with men and women. And so I think that was part of him trying to create a legacy, yes. As a side note, I mean, this is not what you were asking exactly, but you know, one of my dreams is that maybe I can also get hold of Le Clercq's, I can go to Le Clercq's collections too, and those are housed in New York City Ballet. They have a separate archive, because I feel like she must have kept his letters and his doodles and his illustrated letters, but it's very difficult to get in touch with them. They haven't responded from those archives. So as a researcher, you're always in the mercy of the people who are the gatekeepers. So if they don't respond, it's hard to do anything about it. But I have faith that one day I'll get them to respond, and maybe there's more from him in Le Clercq's archives too. Thank you.
I loved the way in which you're probing the term correspondence in sort of at multiple levels. And for obvious reasons, I was really curious about your use of the concept of adjacency, or being adjacent. And so I just kind of wanted to probe correspondence a little bit farther, which is, so you sort of initially start to think about correspondence in relationship to their physical correspondence as partners, right? As physical partners who are doing a kind of duet, the pas de deux, right? But the transition from her losing her ability to dance into this correspondence that becomes so intense also has a kind of arc. And the arc is, on the one hand, that it sort of creates these restorative and reparative intimacies at its peak, right, of what you're saying that it does for her and it does for him, both in terms of giving her confidence to write, but also in terms of giving him some clarity. But it dissolves into this other thing that is really interesting to me, which is that correspondence always also has a connotation of equivalence but not equity, right? That there's something imbalanced. And that's something that I think begins in this notion of the choreographer and the dancer, when he transitions from being her partner to her choreographer. And so I wanted you to think out loud with me about that, and also about the notion of correspondence as having the connotation of conformity or agreement, which they may have had at the beginning, but they don't seem to have as he no longer responds. So there's a really interesting sort of arc of what correspondence means when you're tracing it from the initial phase of being one's partner, right? As a ballet partner, even if it's love that's not necessarily in a romantic partnership, to the intimacy that they create through that, to the kind of abandonment that happens toward the end, and that all of those things are in the term correspondence.
Yes, thank you. This is very helpful. Thank you, Tina. Yeah, what's interesting here is to reflect a little bit about, again, what the archives tell us, and then what is actually real life, which you don't see when you're in the archives. And so you have to go to people who actually knew those two as people in life. So the archives really do tell the story of correspondence as an abandonment. Like, he steps out, she's there saying, why don't you write more? Why don't you write more? And there is a sense of imbalance there too, because Robbins doesn't really talk about that so much in the surviving letters, but he was at that time really a very thriving choreographer. In the 50s, he made so many ballets. The 57, right around this time, is when West Side Story came out, and then 61 or 62 is when it was made into a movie. So he was constantly traveling and doing great work as a choreographer. And so there's that. What was I going to say about it? Oh, yes. So it does feel like he got busy, stepped out, maybe started calling more often than wrote. But then it is true that the two of them stayed very close friends throughout their lives. So Robbins would oftentimes go to her apartment and help her move things around, and he invited her to his countryside home and took her to Spoleto, Italy, and made sure that she was well taken care of and all that. So that's the humanly part that is not part of the correspondence. The correspondence really happens because they were living on two different continents, and she was very lonely during that time too, obviously. What else was I going to say about this? Your question was so deep and long. So correspondence, yes. How to probe, losing, yes. Imbalance, male, female. Well, Robbins also had some other correspondences at the same time too that were pretty lengthy with some other women. That's not the part of this talk.
So yeah, thank you for the talk. It's really inspiring to think about these things with you. And I'm with Tina too, thinking about different words that you might pull out, or that you might want to say more about now. Even the telling word pas de deux. And its own adjacencies and correspondences and imbalances that could go with that, and then just to kind of play on words that eventually they're not two. Pas de deux, and also the fact that pas refers to her step, isn't that so? And eventually there is no step in their relationship. And I don't know what to make of all of that, but I keep thinking about the term pas de deux, and you play with it in the things I've written. And I wonder if you might want to say more about it. One more thing is that it strikes me as an archival problem with dance, that there's almost nothing there to look at, in the sense that even when you see the film, sometimes the camera doesn't show you the feet, or you don't see what's happening on, the camera fixes on one, and where's the other?
Mm-hmm.
And so I wonder about that problem just as an archival researcher.
Yes. Nowadays, of course, it's different. People record things. It's a different scenario. But my work on Robbins has mostly been on writings, and it's the story of him as a writer that people really don't know at all. So in that sense, I've been in a better shape, and I feel like I'm very lucky in this regard, because as a person, Robbins, I've been told, was very closed, kind of private. Also had a very harsh demeanor, very, very hard on his dancers. So to show the side of him that comes from the writings rather than the dance work, that is very vulnerable and very tormented and very loving, is something that emerges from the writings only, not really from the. I mean, it does emerge from the choreography too, but that's a performative level. Pas de deux, yes, it becomes a pas de deux on the page. It becomes a kind of a dynamic that is, I've tried to think about this in writing a little bit. I'm still thinking through this question of how, as part of one of the big questions that I have right now in terms of my writing, is that, well, how, if I use the term pas de deux to describe their written correspondence, what does that really mean? What does that help me do? But it is quite remarkable that this correspondence is they're very much in sync with one another. They really do respond, like in a physical pas de deux. You make a step, your partner has to somehow respond to you. You can't really do anything on your own so much. And the correspondence is they're really listening to one another a lot in those letters. There's one letter that Robbins wrote. He titled it Letter to Carrie. It's in the archives. And he says it's a letter, but you can immediately see it's not a letter, because it doesn't record anything of the presence of the other person in the letter. It's kind of like me writing about my life at the Cité in Paris, but not really inquiring anything about the other person. So it becomes more, for Robbins, also an essay. So what's remarkable about this pas de deux between him and the clerk is this very close, I'm here, I'm listening to you, I'm sending you this little line, I'm sending you this little poem that I'm not going to publish somewhere. It's not for my posterity to publish this poem. I create this poem for you, and it's meant for you. And he didn't just, the little limericks and poems, he didn't just like, let me write this down. In the archives, you see that he was actually drafting these and crossing lines out, and he was really thinking about those before he sent them to Le Clercq. That's all that comes to me right now.
So thank you so much for the fascinating talk and the images that we never could have seen anywhere else. Mm-hmm. Continuing this theme of pas de deux, Balanchine himself was completely absent from your talk, and I'm wondering if Robbins had correspondence with him as well, and what kind of role did he play in all of this? And then second, with Balanchine, you read a letter that she had written about, of course, her tragic polio, and that she didn't believe in anything, and she had nothing to grasp. And I know that Balanchine was very devoted to Gurdjieff, and I just wondered if how she dealt with his own religion that was a little bit unusual.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah, he had a very spiritual outlook. That's right. Now, very good point. Thank you. The reason why Balanchine didn't figure in here so much is that other people have written about Balanchine and Le Clercq, and it's very remarkable. You're absolutely right that when Le Clercq contracted polio, and people have said that at that point in their relationship, before the illness happened, they almost were about to separate, but it was the illness that brought them together, and he was really devoted to her and made up exercises and very, like, every day did things for her to get better. So he took good care of her during that time, didn't leave her side. So that's a fact. We know that about Balanchine. Oh, what else was I going to say about this? Absent from this story. Oh, yes, the correspondence. Now, it's interesting. Robbins, in his materials, doesn't really talk about Balanchine so much. Talks a little bit, but not extensively. There's one little letter in the Le Clercq collection folders. It's a short letter from Robbins to Balanchine saying, "Dear Balanchine, I heard what happened to Tanny and I'm in shock, and let me know if there's anything I can do." It's a brief letter, but yes. My understanding was that Balanchine also he wasn't into writing and verbal expression in written ways, so there's not that much correspondence between Robbins and Balanchine either. He talks about his dreams about Balanchine and also how it was important, like what the sort of working dynamic is between them. But yeah, in the letters, not so much about Balanchine either. They don't really talk so much. Le Clercq mentions that I think Balanchine is really in a bad shape when he comes and sees me. But that's pretty much it. Was there something else? I feel like I didn't answer your question. Oh, the Gurdjieff. The Gurdjieff, I don't know. Yes. Yes, I haven't looked into that exactly myself. Didn't he also study Pilates or something? And he probably borrowed exercises from there. And I know that he made up exercises himself and physically also manipulated her. But I haven't seen the Gurdjieff in direct physical ways affecting her. I know that he was a very spiritual man, Balanchine was, and he really had a lot of belief that Tanny's going to get better.
Because Gurdjieff himself had a tragic crime. Somehow he managed to come back from that. And then he invented all those dance techniques and music,
Right.
I just wondered if
Yes.
something to that.
Yes. I'll look into that. Thank you. Maybe in his... Pauline? Oh, Severine.
Yeah. So not so much a question, just a remark. As your dance student, and I thought it was really beautiful and very touching the way you talked about the physical and emotional experience of being in the archive, and I thought it was particularly interesting how you sort of started with showing images of the correspondence and saying, don't look at what's written, but just really look at the words. I mean, at the typography or the calligraphy.
Yes.
And at first that didn't resonate so much, but then when you see really this shift in Tanny's writing with the disease, it becomes incredibly moving and empowering. And then as many questions also related to the question of the pas de deux, I thought it was really beautiful how we talked about the limitations of Tanny, due to her disease, and then how she's sort of, I don't know if compensating, but then, there's this whole work of creativity that's going in the writing, and you showed the kisses, and that seemed almost like a choreographic creation on the page with the limitations that she has, because she's probably very limited in her movements, but how she used this limitation in an incredibly creative way, inventing a choreography on the page. So in some ways, we talked about her being less empowered as the dancer, and then this power dynamic between the two, but through the creation of the kisses, creating this new choreography on the page of kisses.
Yes, so true.
I was also really sort of, the X's, it's very, very suggestive, but, but one way that the X comes up is in any theatrical production. So, it's your mark, like it's so that when you're setting the lighting or when you're positioning. So the deep familiarity in a performance setting of the shape of the X.
So interesting.
On the stage. But I believe you may find it productive to look into, well, you've been immersed in Robbins's papers, you probably know the answer to this, but the X's are used in a lot of different kinds of attempts at dance notation. So, to mark, and in that first use looks like Tanaquil Le Clercq is using X's in the ways that people who've attempted to notate choreography use them. You know, because you're trying to represent time in one place, and you can use the same X moving somewhere to take motion. So it would be an interesting and nice bit of sort of textural material for you to look into what in the educational and performance context that Clerk was in, what they were using then and there
Right.
in the way of forms of notation, and give another layer to the way that the X means something on the page, and particularly the ways dance notation is trying to use marks on a page in order to represent an embodied art, but also an art that is in time as well as in place.
And emotion too. Yeah. Thank you. That's very useful. Yes.
I've just seen Homage twice. With I'm from New York. I don't need it.
It's for the recording.
Oh, having just seen the Homage twice with two different casts. My favorites, Miriam and Matthias, magnificent in the afternoon. To see the original is very precious. So I thank you for that.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for saying that. Yes.
I urge everybody to go see it.
Yes.
Magnificent.
If there are tickets left, yes. They're doing Afternoon of a Faun here at the ballet opera. They're also doing Fancy Free and a suite of dances and class pieces.
It's really been a very helpful session to hear what people have had to say and what you've had to say, especially. And now I've been mulling over the position of the dancer working in front of a mirror, which you point out, and the idea of Robbins writing these letters to her or notes to himself, but hasn't he always got that? He's keeping those letters and making sure that he knows he's Robbins, and that there's a potential for them to have a life as he thinks about writing for her, for the future, for himself, through some sort of sense of correspondence, which I think is it's just fascinating to think about this privacy and a public voice to a public presentation.
Yes. There's one letter to another person, also a female, that's very striking. It has a line in it that runs something like, it's from Robbins to this other woman, and he says something like, da-da-da-da-da-da, or publish this letter. So it was very interesting for me to hear that he actually thought of publishing, or somebody else publishing his letters. There was a thought that had occurred to him. He suggested to somebody, why don't you publish my letter to you?
That points to another kind of correspondence. Correspondence with a T rather than like a journalist correspondent who's publishing these thoughts, and that it's a record. It's a record of this person and their thoughts. And so in that way it is, I mean, it's so interesting that you raised the idea that, you know, in the back of his mind as he's ascending as a choreographer, he's also sort of, this intimate exchange is becoming his personal archive, right? And that she is a correspondent of sorts. He is a correspondent of their respective lives. And so again, that I mean, I just think it's really fantastic the way in which you're opening up all the possibilities of what a correspondence could mean.
Thank you. Thank you. That's it. That's it. Yes. Thank you.